Welcome back, and thanks for joining us for episode 22 of the Kennedy Americans podcast. I'm your host, Lori Spencer. Please take a moment to like this video, share, and subscribe to our channel here on YouTube or on our Rumble channel at rumble.com/Kennedy Americans. Americans have a certain nostalgia for the 1950s, a romantic notion in their heads that this was our last decade of great economic prosperity. But it isn't true. From 1953 to 1960, America experienced stagflation and 3 recessions on President Eisenhower's watch. JFK turned it around. At the time President Kennedy took office in 1961, unemployment was at 7.7%. By the end of his presidency, unemployment dropped to under 5% and continued to fall through the mid-1960s as President Lyndon Johnson continued JFK's economic policies. Between the time that JFK took office until he died in 1963, the U.S. gross national product rose from $500 billion to $600 billion, an impressive 20% increase in only 3 years. Industrial production increased 22%, and personal income rose 15%. During Kennedy's 1,000 days in office, there was an increase in consumer purchasing power, a drop in wholesale industrial prices, and a rise in income. Prices remained stable to a degree unmatched during the same period by any other industrialized nation in the world. In 1963, Kennedy proposed a general tax cut, with the largest percentage going to the poorest third of the population and to small businesses.
And if we can take the proper action in the proper time, this can be the most important step we could take to prevent another recession. That is the right kind of a tax cut, both for your family budget and the national budget, resulting from a permanent basic reform and reduction in our rate structure, a creative tax cut, creating more jobs and income, and eventually more revenue. And the right time for that kind of bill, it now appears, in the absence of an economic crisis today, and if the job is to be done in a responsible way, is January 1963. Such a bill will be presented to the Congress for action next year. It will include an across-the-board, top-to-bottom cut in both corporate and personal income taxes. It will include long-needed tax reforms that logic and equity demand. And it will date that cut in taxes to take effect as of the start of next year, January 1963. The billions of dollars this bill will place in the hands of the consumer and our businessmen will have both immediate and permanent benefits to our economy. Every dollar released from taxation that is spent or invested will help create a new job and a new salary. And these new jobs and new salaries can create other jobs and other salaries, and more customers and more growth for an expanding American economy. Instead of being permanently saddled with excess planned capacity and the budgetary deficit that is created by this means, our goal must be full capacity and full employment and the budgetary surpluses that kind of employment and capacity can produce.
On May 1st, 1961, Kennedy signed the Area Redevelopment Act, creating funds to encourage business investment in poorer areas of the nation. JFK also signed the Accelerated Public Works Act, which created funding for construction of highways and other infrastructure in those poorer regions of the country. JFK signed the Manpower Development and Training Act, which targeted unemployed people with inadequate or obsolete skills, training them for new careers. Those in the program were paid a training allowance for 52 weeks and given relocation assistance if required for a new job. JFK signed the Higher Education Facilities Act, which created funding for community colleges and technical schools, the first general education law enacted by Congress since World War II. Kennedy also proposed college tuition grants and low-interest loans for needy students. The first executive order signed by JFK on January 21, 1961, expanded the food stamp program and increased the nutritional content of food provided to the poor. The number of Americans receiving surplus food doubled from 3.5 million in January of 61 to 6.1 million in only 2 months. In March of 1961, JFK extended unemployment benefits from 26 to 39 weeks. In May of that year, he signed a bill to extend aid to children of unemployed parents, while at the same time increasing federal resources for able-bodied job seekers to find employment. That same month, Kennedy signed off on increasing the minimum wage from $1 to $1.25 an hour. In June of 1961, JFK signed a new law increasing Social Security benefits by almost 30%. The eligibility age for Social Security was reduced, widower benefits increased, and disability filing periods were extended. Kennedy also pushed hard for the creation of Medicare for the aged. The bill was well on its way to passing at the time of JFK's assassination. President Johnson later signed it into law. LBJ later created the Medicaid program to provide insurance for low-income individuals. In addition, Kennedy signed the Equal Pay Act for women, which allowed a competitive living wage for females in the workplace. Even in late 1963, he wasn't finished. At JFK's last cabinet meeting before his death, he scribbled and circled the word poverty 7 times. Kennedy's economic policies show us that we can have growth at home without waging war abroad. We can reduce unemployment. We can raise the standard of living for all and keep inflation in check. President Kennedy shattered many myths about the potential of the American economy. Keeping inflation low was essential to JFK's economic policy. He referred to inflation as, quote, a cruel tax upon the weak. What good would his 25% increase in the minimum wage accomplish if it would just be eaten up by inflation? Steel prices were critical to price stability because steel was a major element in industrial costs. Its price was either a direct or indirect cost in every other commodity. A steel price increase would quickly reverberate throughout the economy, creating an inflationary spiral. The United Steelworkers of America Union and the company U.S. Steel were due for contract renegotiations in 1962. JFK had reached out to both the company and the union to express his concerns over the possible creation of an inflationary spiral. JFK offered his help to negotiate an agreement that would not require an increase in prices. Both parties agreed to his involvement. The president was able to negotiate an agreement with the union to forego a wage increase, thus eliminating the need for a price increase. On April 10, 1962, with the last major contract of agreement on the wage increase having just been signed, JFK was surprised to find in his appointment calendar a meeting with Roger Blau, chairman of U.S. Steel. Blau came to the Oval Office and said to the president frankly, quote, "Perhaps the easiest way I can explain the purpose of my visit," and handed JFK a press release that was being simultaneously distributed to the media. It stated that U.S. Steel, quote, "effective 12:01 a.m. tomorrow, will raise the price of the company's steel products by an average of about 3.5%. Kennedy read the statement and recognized immediately that U.S. Steel had double-crossed him and the steel workers. JFK said to Roger Blau, quote, "You've made a terrible mistake." JFK then conferred with some of his advisors, who recalled never seeing him so angry. One said that there should have been a speedometer on his rocking chair. Kennedy said, quote, "My father always told me that all businessmen were sons of bitches, but I never believed it until now." Kennedy felt he had been betrayed. While he did not believe a president had any right to tell a company how to price its products, he did believe that he had the right to transparency and honesty from the company when their price setting had such a massive impact on the overall well-being of the U.S. economy. Kennedy had offered to negotiate with the steel workers, and all parties knew that this negotiation was for the purpose of keeping wages and hence prices and hence inflation steady. U.S. Steel welcomed Kennedy's negotiation to maintain stable wages without ever mentioning they had no intention of keeping prices stable. So now, not only was the economy going to go into an inflationary spiral, but JFK looked like a liar to the steel workers, essentially getting them to capitulate on wages for nothing. Kennedy also understood that this was a direct attack on the prestige of the office of the president. The U.S. Steel Board of Directors consisted of some of the heaviest Wall Street power players. They were essentially letting Kennedy know that they were running the show. Kennedy felt his entire economic program, as well as his presidency, was at stake here. The next morning, U.S. Steel was joined in its price increase by Bethlehem Steel, the second largest company, and soon after by 4 other companies. Defense contracts were critical to the steel industry. Defense Secretary Robert McNamara told President Kennedy that the impact on defense costs by the increase in steel prices would be $1 billion. Kennedy ordered him to immediately start shifting steel purchases to smaller companies that had not joined in the price increase. He even told him to look into overseas suppliers if that was necessary to keep defense contracts away from U.S. Steel and its cohorts. JFK then had his brother, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, convene a federal grand jury to investigate price fixing. The Attorney General also ordered the FBI to begin an investigation. Robert Kennedy later said in his oral history interview, quote, "We were going to go for broke. Their expense accounts and where they'd been and what they were doing, I picked up all their records, and I told the FBI to interview them all, march into their offices the very next day. We weren't going to go slowly. I said to have them done all over the country. All of them were hit with meetings the next morning by federal agents. All of them were subpoenaed for their personal records, and all of them were subpoenaed for their company records." At his presidential press conference the following day, April 11th, JFK called out the steel industry to gasps in the room.
The simultaneous and identical actions of United States Steel and other leading steel corporations increasing steel prices by some $6 a ton constitute a wholly unjustifiable and irresponsible defiance of the public interest. In this serious hour in our nation's history, when we are confronted with grave crises in Berlin and Southeast Asia, when we are devoting our energies to economic recovery and stability, when we are asking reservists to leave their homes and families for months on end, and servicemen to risk their lives, and 4 were killed in the last 2 days in Vietnam, and asking union members to hold down their wage requests, at a time when restraint and sacrifice are being asked of every citizen, the American people will find it hard, as I do, to accept a situation in which a tiny handful of steel executives, whose pursuit of private power and profit exceeds their sense of public responsibility, can show such utter contempt for the interests of 185 million Americans. A few gigantic corporations have decided to increase prices in ruthless disregard of their public responsibilities. Some time ago, I asked each American to consider what he would do for his country, and I asked the steel companies. In the last 24 hours, we had their answer.
President Kennedy went on to say, in response to questions from reporters, The simultaneous and identical actions of United States Steel and other leading steel corporations increasing steel prices by some $6 a ton constitute a wholly unjustifiable and irresponsible defiance of the public interest. If this rise in the cost of steel is not rescinded, it would increase the cost of homes, automobiles, appliances, and most every item for every American family. It would increase the cost of machinery and tools to every American businessman and farmer. It would seriously handicap our efforts to prevent an inflationary spiral from eating up the pensions of our older citizens and our new gains in purchasing powers. The facts of the matter are that there is no justification for an increase in steel prices. A few gigantic corporations have decided to increase prices in ruthless disregard of their public responsibilities. On April 13th, Bethlehem Steel became the first steel company to buckle and rescind its price increase. The reason, as reported back to the White House, was that, quote, Bethlehem had gotten wind that it was about to be excluded from bidding on the construction of 3 Navy vessels the following week. By the end of the day, all 6 steel companies announced that they were rescinding their price increases. Robert Kennedy's Justice Department, however, continued its antitrust investigation. U.S. Steel and 7 other steel companies were eventually forced to pay minimum fines in 1965 for their price-fixing activities between 1955 and 1961. The attacks on Kennedy by the press, however, were brutal. U.S. News and World Report accused JFK of running a planned economy and suggested he was acting like a Soviet commissar. The Wall Street Journal accused the Kennedy brothers of achieving a price rescindment by the use of naked power, threats, and the use of agents of the state security police. Attorney General Robert Kennedy became the symbol of ruthless power, and the media to this day still portray Robert Kennedy as, quote, ruthless. U.S. Steel Chairman Roger Blau referred to Kennedy's actions as retaliatory attacks and said that never before in the nation's history had so many forces of the federal government been marshaled against a single industry. Appearing a few days later before the United Auto Workers Union, Kennedy said,
You've recognized this in your historic fights against prejudice and poverty and neglected old age. And I remember attending a meeting near Detroit of those members of your union who had retired and who are still consider themselves active participants in the United Auto Workers, even though they are now living all around the great city of Detroit, but yet they came and participated in a great Sunday afternoon where I was present. You demonstrated your responsibility in the resolution which you adopted yesterday, reaffirming your intention, and I quote, to seek wage increases and improvements in fringe benefits out of the fruits of advancing technology and not through price increases. And you recognized it in your 1961 contract with the automobile industry, contracts which have contributed to price stability, for the responsible outlook demonstrated by that agreement, which served your members and the community, the industry, and this union, deserve a vote of thanks from the country. But your task, like mine and the American people, is never done. The same responsibility for a non-inflationary and peaceful settlement applies both to you and to management in your forthcoming negotiations in the aircraft and missile industries. I am confident that you will meet that obligation, exercising the restraint and responsibility which will, in the end, reward you as it rewards the country. For I do not believe it is necessary to remind this audience that neither you nor I believe in the philosophy that what is good for one company or one union is automatically good for the United States. I believe instead that what is good for the United States, for the people as a whole, is going to be good for every American company and for every American union. Now, I know there are some people who say that this isn't any business of the President of the United States, and who believe that the President of the United States should be the honorary chairman of a great fraternal organization and confine himself to ceremonial functions. But that isn't what the Constitution says. And I did not run for President of the United States to fulfill that office in that way. Harry Truman once said there are 14 or 15 million Americans who have the resources to have representatives in Washington to protect their interests. And that the interests of the great mass of the other people, the 150 or 60 million, is the responsibility of the President of the United States, and I propose to fulfill it. Then I believe it is the business of the President of the United States to concern himself with the general welfare and the public interest, and if the people feel that it is not, then they should secure the services of a new President of the United States. We need a permanent unemployment insurance program so that there are those who want to work and can't find a job will not be shifted and living on a marginal income without hope for themselves. These are things which other countries in Western Europe did 30 or 40 years ago. Great Britain, and we regard ourselves as a progressive society, had these provisions at the time of the First World War. And yet this is suggested as a most radical proposal. There is no reason why, if your skin is colored, you have twice as much chance to be unemployed, about a half as much chance to own your house, about a half or a third as much chance of your son or daughter going to college. This country is a free society in which everyone can succeed or fail based on what they have inside of them, not what they have outside. Imagine in this rich country of ours, 8 million children leaving before they finish the 12th grade. 1 out of 4 today out of work. The great lack, the most difficult places to find work in the 60s will be for those boys and girls without a good education and without training. And we want to make sure that every American has a chance to develop his talents. Education is basic to the preservation of a democracy. We are going to have twice as many of our sons and daughters trying to get into college in 1970 as tried in 1960. We have to, in the next 8 years, build as many school buildings as we've built in our entire history. And yet, we have found it extremely difficult to secure support for this vital program. We cannot leave the 17 million people who have retired and who may become ill. If they have no money, under the legislation now on the books, they have a chance to receive some as indigents. But that is not the way we believe it should be done. And if their son happens to have some money in the bank, they do not qualify. And he goes and pays out, and it may break him at a time when he has responsibilities to his children. Why it is so difficult to secure passage of a minimum wage, paying somebody in interstate commerce $1 or $1.10 or 15 cents, I do not understand. But it is regarded in some circles as highly radical and highly inflationary. For the first time, unemployed men can retire at 62. For the first time. And I do not regard this as a particularly radical proposal. Dependent children can receive aid for the first time in our history without the wage earner deserting his family. In the old days, before this act was passed, if a child was undernourished, it was necessary for the wage earner to desert his wife and family in order that those children should qualify for assistance. But last year that was changed.
In 2024, after years of Bidenflation and Bidenomics, we need a president who understands how to make things better for all Americans. and who is willing to use that understanding to benefit the public interest. RFK Jr., I believe, is the only one who will deliver for the people the way that his uncle JFK did. I'm Lori Spencer. Thanks for watching.